Hello, everyone. Today we're going to sit together in a moment that feels too quiet to ignore. The kind of quiet that doesn't soothe you, but instead presses down, heavy on your chest. I'm in my living room, the clock on the wall ticking louder than it ever has, while the table beside me glows with the soft light of candles I placed there earlier. The smell of roasted chicken still lingers in the air, mixed with cinnamon and pine from the decorations I bought just for tonight. But there's no laughter, no voices, no footsteps coming through the door. Only me, waiting in a house that feels too big for one person. I had told them, every one of them, that this would be the last time. Come home, I said. Let's have one more reunion, one more night together, before the years scatter us even further. I didn't say it out of drama. I said it because I knew how much time had already passed, how many pieces of myself I had poured into these gatherings, and how tired I was of waiting to be chosen. Tonight was supposed to matter. Tonight was supposed to mean something. Instead, I am surrounded by empty chairs and untouched plates. I set the table like I always do, silverware polished until it shined, napkins folded carefully. Each seat had a little card with a name written in gold ink. I even made their favorite dishes, the ones they always requested when they were young. I thought if I recreated the taste of home, they would come. That maybe nostalgia would pull them back. But the only thing nostalgia has pulled tonight is me, back into memories of better times. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I'm doing here. Because these stories, they aren't about easy endings. They're about the parts of life we don't talk about, the silences that hurt more than words, the moments when family doesn't show up even when you've given them everything. And I'd love to know, where are you watching this from, and what time of day is it for you? Drop it in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, even if the people closest to me refuse to come. The hardest part isn't the food going cold or the gifts wrapped and untouched under the tree. It's the ache of realization. I could set 1,000 tables, and they might still choose something else. A trip, a vacation, an easier way out. The truth is sharper than any knife I used to carve tonight's meal. And as I sit here, staring at a row of chairs lined up like a stage waiting for actors who will never walk in, I feel the curtain falling on the life I thought I had. But if this is my last reunion, then let me tell you the whole story. Not because it ends with happiness, it doesn't. But because sometimes survival isn't about winning. It's about finally seeing the truth, even when it breaks you.
When I close my eyes, the silence of tonight takes me back, not to this dim room where the clock beats too loudly, but to the echoes of gatherings that once filled every corner with warmth. I can still see the backyard of our old house, where summer reunions stretched into the night. The grill was hot, the air thick with the smell of corn on the cob and sizzling meat. Children darted between the grown-ups, sticky hands clutching melting ice cream cones, while the adults clinked glasses and told the same family stories we never seemed to tire of. That was the rhythm of our lives. Laughter spilling across the lawn, and me quietly watching with a smile, certain that this bond would outlast everything. I remember Christmas mornings too, when the tree lights blinked like little promises. We'd all gather in pajamas, hair messy, eyes still heavy with sleep, tearing wrapping paper as if the world outside didn't exist. The kids used to squeal with joy when they opened their gifts, and I used to think, this is it. This is the reward for all the long hours, the saving and sacrificing, the endless little acts of care. Family was supposed to be the return on that investment. But somewhere along the way, the script changed. The phone calls grew shorter, the visits less frequent, and when they did come, it was with eyes glued to their phones or conversations carried on like obligations. I told myself it was just the busyness of life, the pull of adulthood, the natural way things evolve. Still, I waited for the moments when they would look up at me and smile the way they once did, as if nothing had changed. Now, tonight, with this table set for ghosts, I realize that maybe I have been the one clinging to a past that only existed because I built it. Maybe those memories weren't held equally in their hearts. Maybe they saw those reunions as chores, while I saw them as lifelines. And that thought, sharper than any betrayal, lingers in the corners of my mind. I walk slowly around the table, fingers brushing over the folded napkins, the empty glasses. Each place reminds me of a face. Here, my son who once begged me to make extra mashed potatoes because he couldn't get enough. There, my daughter-in-law, who used to laugh so loudly it filled the room. And at the far end, the children, once so eager for my attention, now old enough to look through me like I was part of the furniture. I try to summon the warmth of those moments, but the echoes fade too quickly, swallowed by the truth. It's a strange kind of mourning, grieving not for someone who died, but for the version of family I believed I had. Mourning for the belief that effort and love guaranteed loyalty. Because if the past was real, if those memories mattered to them the way they matter to me, then tonight would not be empty. Tonight would not feel like a house stripped bare. I pour myself a glass of wine and sit down at the head of the table, my chair scraping too loudly against the floor. For a moment, I pretend. I pretend the voices will come through the door any second, the way they used to. That maybe the phone will ring and someone will say, "We're on our way." But pretending is all I have left, and even that feels thin, like paper tearing in my hands. Memories are supposed to comfort us, but tonight they burn. They remind me not just of what I had, but of what I no longer do. And as the candles flicker low, I realize that memories can be both a gift and a curse. Beautiful to hold, unbearable to compare. The more I think about those memories, the more another truth presses into me. Every one of those reunions, every one of those so-called family traditions, came at a cost. Not just the obvious costs, the groceries, the decorations, the travel arrangements I sometimes covered when someone claimed they couldn't afford it, but the quieter, heavier costs that no one ever really saw. The hours at work when I pushed myself past exhaustion, the vacations I never took, the little luxuries I denied myself so I could afford to make theirs possible. Love, for me, has always been measured in sacrifice. It's how I was raised. You show you care by giving, by providing, by stretching yourself until there's nothing left. And for years, I convinced myself that was the right way. If I could just keep giving, eventually, they would see it. They would mirror it. They would meet me halfway. But instead, I became the one everyone leaned on, and no one thought to ask how much weight I was carrying. I think of the time I pulled together a Thanksgiving dinner, even when I was sick with the flu. My body ached, my throat burned, but I still roasted the turkey, still baked the pies, because I didn't want to disappoint anyone. They ate, they laughed, and when I excused myself early to lie down, they barely noticed. That was the price I paid, and that became the story of my life, making sure no one else went without, even if it meant I did. It's not just about the money, though I can't ignore how many bills I covered, how many times I reached into savings that should have been for my own future. College tuition, mortgage assistance, medical co-pays. I told myself it was temporary, that they'd pay me back, or at least show their gratitude in time. But the payback never came. Gratitude was short-lived, and slowly, I realized I was not an equal in this family. I was the provider, the caretaker, the one they expected to always show up. Sitting at this empty table now, I see it clearly. I spent years mistaking obligation for love. They never asked me not to make sacrifices, but they never stopped me either. They accepted them as their due, like it was normal for me to shoulder everything while they got to enjoy the rewards. And the saddest part is, I thought that was what love was supposed to be. Tonight is different. Tonight the silence is so sharp, it cuts through the illusions I built. I can't keep pretending these sacrifices bought me a place in their lives. I can't keep telling myself that if I just give a little more, things will change. Because the truth is, my sacrifices didn't build love. They built entitlement. And the more I gave, the less they valued it. I push back my chair and walk into the kitchen. On the counter, there's a stack of receipts from this week alone. The wine, the decorations, the groceries. A small fortune for a meal no one came to eat. I pick them up, stare at the numbers, and laugh. Not a happy laugh, but the bitter kind that rattles in your chest. All that effort, all that money, for nothing. Or maybe not for nothing. Maybe for the lesson I should have learned long ago. Because here's the truth. Love given freely should be met with love in return. And if it isn't, then it's not love. It's a transaction. And tonight, staring at this pile of receipts, I realize I've been in a one-sided transaction for years. The days leading up to the reunion had been a blur of planning. I poured myself into every detail, as if perfection itself could convince them to show up. The grocery lists filled 2 pages, every favorite dish accounted for. I drove to 3 different stores to get the imported chocolates my granddaughter once said she loved. I ordered new linens for the dining table, even though the old ones were perfectly fine, because I wanted the table to sparkle in photographs. I spent hours stringing lights across the living room, carefully wrapping each banister so the house would glow warm and festive. I told myself that if I made it beautiful enough, if I made it irresistible, then maybe, just maybe, they would see how much it mattered. Maybe they would put me first, just this once. I decorated the tree with ornaments collected over the years, each one a story in itself. The silver bell from our first Christmas together. The hand-painted reindeer from my son's kindergarten class, its colors fading, but still precious. Even the fragile glass angel that cracked one year when it fell, which I glued back together because it still felt like part of us. Every corner of the house held a memory, and I polished each one like a prayer. The kitchen became my battlefield, the scent of cinnamon rolls cooling on the counter, the turkey resting under foil, pies lined up in perfect rows. I chopped, stirred, kneaded, baked, my hands aching by the end of the night, but my heart telling me it was worth it. Because this time, surely this time, they would see me. I even wrapped gifts for everyone, though no one had asked me to. Small things, chosen with care. A scarf in her favorite color. A book he once mentioned offhand. Toys I thought the children would squeal over. I wrapped them in gold paper and tied each with ribbon, imagining their smiles as they tore through the paper. That image kept me going, even as doubt began to whisper at the edges. But the hardest part of the preparation wasn't the cooking or the decorating. It was the hope. The fragile, stubborn hope that clung to me like a shadow. Every time I set down a fork or smoothed a tablecloth, I thought, this will be the detail that makes it perfect. This will be the thing that makes them realize. It was like trying to buy love with effort, as if enough beauty, enough food, enough generosity could outweigh years of growing distance. The night before the reunion, I barely slept. I walked through the house one last time, turning off the lights, pausing in the doorway of the dining room. The table was set like a stage waiting for its actors. I could almost hear the clatter of dishes, the laughter, the familiar chorus of voices rising and falling. I smiled to myself, trying to quiet the anxiety in my chest. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow they'll come. Tomorrow, it will all be worth it. And now, standing in this same room, I feel the sting of that memory. The house was ready. The food was waiting. The gifts were stacked like little promises under the tree. Everything was perfect. Everything except the one thing I couldn't control. Their choice. The first cracks began to show long before tonight, though I didn't want to see them. They were small at first, easy to excuse, easy to explain away if I wanted to keep the dream alive. A delayed reply to my messages. A vague, "we'll see," when I asked about their schedules. Promises that sounded more like placeholders than commitments. I told myself they were busy, that life with children and jobs and responsibilities was hectic. And maybe it was. But deep down, I felt the shift. The enthusiasm that once sparked in their voices when I suggested a reunion had dulled into something flat, like an obligation they hadn't yet figured out how to avoid. It's strange how silence can be louder than words. I noticed it when I sent reminders about the menu. No answers. When I asked if they had any requests for desserts or side dishes, no answers. When I suggested games we used to play, or asked if they wanted me to set up the photo albums, still silence. Every unread message became a little stone in my chest, heavy and impossible to ignore. And yet, I carried them anyway, because to admit what they meant would have been too painful. Then came the excuses. Casual at first. We might be late, depending on traffic. We'll let you know if the kids are up for it. Work has been exhausting. Each one a thin veil I could see right through. I knew what they really meant. It wasn't a priority. I wasn't a priority. But denial is a stubborn thing, and I clung to it. I told myself they'd come around. I told myself that once the day arrived, they'd remember why these reunions mattered. What hurt most wasn't the words they did say, it was the words they didn't. No one asked what I needed. No one asked how I was feeling. Not a single person said, "We'll be there, we can't wait." That kind of silence speaks volumes. And as the day grew closer, I could feel the distance widening like a crack in glass, spreading across the surface until it was impossible to miss. Still, I kept preparing. Still, I held on. Because what else could I do? I had already built my hope on this foundation, fragile as it was. If I let go too soon, I feared I would collapse with it. So I told myself stories. Maybe they were just distracted. Maybe they were planning a surprise. Maybe they didn't want to spoil the anticipation. The lies I told myself were softer than the truth, and I clung to them like a blanket against the cold. Now, as I sit here in the glow of untouched candles, I see those excuses for what they were. The first signs of abandonment. The distance wasn't sudden. It was slow, creeping, quiet. And maybe that's why it hurts so much more. A clean break would have been easier to face. But this slow unraveling feels like watching a rope fray strand by strand, knowing it will snap, but powerless to stop it.
The call from my eldest son came 3 days before the reunion. I remember exactly where I was, standing in the kitchen, my hands deep in flour as I kneaded dough for the bread I knew he loved. The phone rang, and his name lit up the screen. For a moment, hope bloomed in my chest. I thought maybe he was calling to confirm, to say they couldn't wait, to reassure me that all the silence had been nothing more than busy schedules. But his voice was different. It was steady, practical, almost rehearsed. "Mom," he said, "I wanted to let you know we won't be able to make it. We've already booked a vacation." The words hit harder than I expected. A vacation. I blinked, hands frozen over the dough. I asked him to repeat it, thinking maybe I'd misheard. But no, the tickets were bought, the hotel reserved, the kids already excited. He said it so casually, as though it was an acceptable trade-off, as though choosing a beach or a resort over me was reasonable. My throat tightened, but I tried to keep my voice calm. "I told you," I whispered, "this would be the last reunion, the last one." There was a pause, just long enough for me to hope he might soften, that he might realize what he was saying. But then he answered, cool and unshaken. "I know, Mom. But the timing just didn't work out. The timing, that's what my final invitation boiled down to. Bad timing. Years of hosting, of holding the family together, of sacrifices stacked higher than I could count. And all it took was a vacation to push me aside. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him how he could choose sand and sunsets over me, how he could explain to his children that their grandmother's last request wasn't important enough to honor. But the words caught in my throat, heavy and useless, because deep down I already knew the answer. I wasn't the priority. I hadn't been for a long time. Instead, I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, let it fill the space between us like a wall neither of us wanted to climb. Eventually, he cleared his throat and muttered something about hoping I'd understand. And then, he hung up. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the half-kneaded dough. My hands trembled, leaving white streaks of flour on the counter. I thought of all the years I had believed his words, all the times he'd said, "We'll pay you back. We'll be there. We'll make it up to you." Empty promises, each one now echoing in my ears, louder than ever. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his voice replaying in my mind. A vacation. A vacation was more important than me. And though I tried to tell myself it was just one person, just one family out of many, I knew the truth. This was only the beginning. If my eldest son could turn me down so easily, what hope was left that the others would come?
After my eldest son's call, I still clung to a fragile hope that the others would come. Maybe they would see how much this mattered. Maybe someone, anyone, would prove to me that family still meant something. I checked my phone constantly, waiting for messages that never arrived. Every time the screen lit up, my heart leapt, only to sink again when it was nothing but a reminder, an advertisement, or a wrong number. I sent out gentle reminders. Don't forget, the reunion is this weekend. I added smiley faces, as though cheerfulness could mask the desperation in my words. I asked what time they might be arriving, whether they needed directions or help with travel plans. Hours passed, then days. The silence grew heavier with each unanswered message. It wasn't just quiet, it was deliberate, the kind of silence that chooses not to break. I told myself stories to fill the gaps. Maybe their phones had died. Maybe they were waiting to surprise me. Maybe they were caught up in work or distracted by their children. But the longer it went on, the harder it was to ignore the truth. Their silence was not an accident. It was a choice. When the phone finally did ring, it wasn't comfort. My daughter's voice was rushed, distracted, background noise of laughter and chatter spilling through. "Mom, I don't think we can make it this time," she said quickly, as if ripping off a bandage. "The kids have activities, and honestly, we've been exhausted. We'll try next year." Next year. The words stung like acid. How could she say next year when I had told them this would be the last? It wasn't that she didn't hear me. It was that she didn't care. I hung up and sat in the darkened living room, staring at the neatly set table, the shining silverware reflecting the glow of the lights I had strung with such care. I could almost hear the empty seats mocking me, their silence louder than any rejection. My chest ached with a hollow kind of pain, one that no medicine could ease. As the hours ticked by, no one else called. No confirmations, no apologies, not even excuses. Just silence. And in that silence, I began to understand something I had been avoiding for years. I was no longer part of their lives, not really. I was a figure in the background, convenient when needed, invisible when not. It is a peculiar kind of grief, to be alive yet abandoned. To still breathe, still hope, yet know you have already been erased from the story others are writing without you. Tonight, that grief pressed against me from all sides, suffocating in its quiet certainty. The morning of the reunion came. and with it, a strange stillness. I woke early, the way I always did on days like this, expecting to be filled with anticipation. Instead, I felt a kind of hollow calm, as though my body already knew what my heart was still trying to deny. I moved through the motions anyway. I set the turkey in the oven, basted it every hour, checked the pies cooling on the counter. I reheated the rolls, straightened the napkins, adjusted the ornaments on the tree so they would catch the light just right. Each action felt like a ritual, performed not for them, but for myself, for the memory of all the times when this day meant something. By noon, the house smelled of roasted garlic and cinnamon, rich and warm. I lit the candles, put soft music on the stereo, and stepped back to admire it all. The table looked like a magazine spread, every dish gleaming, every chair waiting, and yet the air felt heavy, the silence unbearable. I checked my phone. Nothing. No calls, no texts, not even the courtesy of a lie. Just silence, sharp and final. 1 o'clock came, then 2. The food sat untouched, steam curling upward before fading into nothing. By 3, I stopped pacing. I sat at the head of the table, staring at the chairs lined neatly in a row, as if they were mocking me. Each one seemed to whisper a name, a memory, a promise broken. I tried to eat. I filled my plate with turkey and potatoes, just enough to pretend I wasn't alone. But the food had no taste, every bite turning heavy in my mouth until I pushed the plate away. Across from me, the empty chairs seemed to multiply. I imagined them filled, laughter bouncing from wall to wall, children running in and out of the kitchen. For a moment, I almost believed it was real. But the silence shattered the illusion. The house was too quiet. Even the music on the stereo sounded thin, like it was embarrassed to play for just one person. I reached for my glass of wine and held it high, as though making a toast. To family, I whispered, the words cracking in my throat. To what was, to what could have been. The glass clinked against nothing. Evening came, and still no one arrived. I blew out the candles, one by one, until the room was swallowed by shadows. The table, once so full of promise, now looked like a stage abandoned after the play had been canceled. The food, cold and untouched, was proof of the truth I could no longer deny. I was not forgotten by accident. I was left behind by choice. And in that realization, the weight of the day pressed harder than ever. This was not just a missed dinner. This was the end of something I had fought for, something I had built piece by piece over the years. Tonight, it collapsed in silence. That night, as the shadows grew long and the house settled into its own quiet breathing, I found myself slipping into a strange state, half dream, half memory. The table still stood in front of me, the plates untouched, the candles melted down to small pools of wax. But in my mind, the seats were no longer empty. I heard voices, familiar, warm, echoing from years ago. My son's laughter, bright and careless, ringing from the far end of the table. My daughter's teasing tone, the way she used to roll her eyes before breaking into a smile. Even the children, once so little, their squeals and questions overlapping like a song I knew by heart. I could see them too. Not as they are now, distant and distracted, but as they were then, leaning close to tell me stories, reaching for another helping, asking me for seconds of dessert I'd made with tired hands, but an eager heart. For a moment, it felt real enough to touch. I caught myself turning my head, expecting to lock eyes with someone across the table. But when I blinked, the illusion shattered. The chairs were empty. The room was still. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the clock kept me company. The ghosts of memory had left, leaving behind only silence. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes, letting the past wash over me one more time. It was bittersweet, comforting to remember, painful to realize that those moments were gone forever. I had spent so many years convincing myself that if I just kept giving, those voices would stay. But memories cannot be fed. They cannot be bribed with roast dinners or wrapped gifts. They slip away, no matter how tightly we clutch them. A strange thought came to me then. Maybe I had been feeding ghosts all along. Maybe I'd been setting the table not for the family I have now, but for the one I once knew, the one that existed only in memory. Perhaps that's why the silence tonight feels heavier. It isn't just their absence I grieve, but the death of who they once were to me. I rose from the table and walked slowly around it, my hand brushing across the backs of the chairs. Each one seemed to hum with its own story, a reminder of the people who once sat there. Here was the chair where my son used to balance his spoon on his nose. Here, the spot where my daughter spilled gravy all over her shirt and laughed until she cried. Here, the place where the children once climbed onto my lap, sticky fingers and wide eyes, calling me the best grandmother in the world. I whispered their names into the empty room, as if speaking them aloud might bring them back. The sound was swallowed by the walls, leaving me with nothing but the echo of my own voice. And that, more than anything, told me the truth. I was alone. Utterly, completely alone. The clock struck midnight, its chime cutting through the silence. I stood still, listening to the echo fade. For the first time all day, I allowed myself to weep, not for the food, not for the wasted effort, but for the love I had given that was never returned. The tears did not stop easily. They came in waves, sudden, sharp, leaving me raw and trembling. And when they finally slowed, I felt emptied out, like the house itself, stripped of sound, stripped of warmth, stripped of meaning. That was when the truth settled over me like a heavy blanket. I could no longer pretend. This wasn't an accident, wasn't a scheduling conflict, wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice, and it was final. I had reached the breaking point. For years, I told myself that my love would be enough to bind us together. That the money I spent, the meals I cooked, the holidays I held in place like glue would mean something. I convinced myself that loyalty could be bought with patience, that devotion could be earned if I only gave more. But sitting at that table, staring at the empty chairs and the cold food, I knew the truth. All I had bought was silence. The betrayal wasn't in the vacation itself. It was in everything leading up to it. The ignored messages, the half-hearted excuses, the casual way they dismissed my final request. And most of all, the knowledge that none of them thought this mattered enough to fight for. The absence was not just physical, it was emotional, spiritual. They had let go of me long before I let go of them. I thought of every sacrifice, every sleepless night spent worrying about them, every dollar scraped together to bail them out of trouble, to help them chase dreams, to cushion their mistakes. I thought of the times I sat in hospital waiting rooms, the times I answered the phone in the middle of the night, the times I gave when I had nothing left to give. And for what? To sit here, alone, at a table built for ghosts. Something inside me cracked then, not like glass shattering in an instant, but like wood under pressure, splintering slowly until the break was undeniable. The illusion I had lived under for so long was gone. They did not see me as the heart of the family. They did not see me at all. I was a convenience, a safety net, a background figure. I was love, unreciprocated. I pushed away from the table, the chair scraping against the floor with a sound that felt final. My body trembled, not with grief this time, but with something sharper. Anger. Anger at them for taking, always taking. Anger at myself for letting them. Anger at the years I could never get back. The years I had spent trying to buy a seat at a table I had already built. I walked through the house, turning off the lights one by one. The glow faded, the shadows deepened, and still the anger simmered beneath my skin. By the time I reached my bedroom, it had hardened into something else. Resolve. I would not beg anymore. I would not set another table for people who chose to leave me behind. If tonight was my last reunion, then so be it. Let it end here, with the truth. I climbed into bed, exhausted but wide awake. The house was silent, but inside me, a storm was raging. I whispered into the darkness, not as a plea, but as a promise. Never again. The morning after felt different. The air was cold, sharp, carrying with it the faintest trace of smoke from the fireplace that had burned low through the night. My head was heavy, but my thoughts were clear. I walked back into the dining room, half expecting, half foolishly hoping, that maybe something would have changed. But the scene was exactly as I'd left it. Food spoiled and stiff, candles melted to stubs, gifts stacked untouched under the tree. I didn't cry this time. Instead, I reached for the notepad sitting on the counter. Its cover was plain, the pages lined, nothing special. Yet when I held the pen in my hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. If they could not listen, then I would write. If they could not remember, then I would record. The first list was simple. What I have given. I wrote down everything I could recall. Money for tuition, down payments, emergencies. I listed the countless meals, the holidays planned, the favors done without hesitation. 3 pages filled quickly, the ink pressing deep into the paper with each memory, each sacrifice. Then I turned the page and began the second list. What I have received. At first, I thought of thank you notes, hugs, promises whispered with a smile. But the more I thought, the fewer words I could find. My pen hovered over the page, refusing to move. In the end, the list was embarrassingly short. Occasional gratitude, fleeting affection, polite calls on holidays. I stared at the imbalance, the grotesque unfairness laid bare in black and white. And then something inside me shifted. For the first time, I saw it without excuses, without denial. This wasn't love, it was transaction. It had always been transaction. They took, I gave, and in return, I was allowed to exist in their orbit. But I wanted more than existence. I wanted to matter. I wrote a final line beneath the lists, never again. The words steadied me, each letter a vow carved into the future. I folded the paper and placed it inside an envelope. I didn't write their names on it. I didn't plan to give it to them. The note wasn't for them, it was for me. A declaration that I could no longer keep living inside a cycle of giving and waiting, giving and hoping. The reunion had broken something, but in its breaking, it had also set something free. I tucked the envelope into the drawer by my bed, where it would wait, not as a plea, not as a threat, but as a reminder. Every time doubt tried to creep back in, every time guilt whispered that I should forgive and try again, I would pull out that note and read the truth I had written in my own hand. It was strange. For the first time in years, I felt steady. Alone, yes. Betrayed, absolutely. But also steady. The act of writing had taken the chaos inside me and turned it into clarity. And as I looked around the room, stripped of its illusions, I thought, maybe this ending isn't destruction. Maybe it's the beginning of something else, The house was still heavy with silence when I heard the knock at the door. It startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone, certainly not after a night like that. The sound was gentle, almost hesitant, as if the visitor wasn't sure whether they should disturb me. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened the door to find my neighbor, Eleanor, standing there with a small basket of cookies. Her eyes scanned my face quickly, and she seemed to understand, without me saying a word. "I noticed the lights were off earlier than usual last night," she said softly. "I thought I'd check in." I wanted to brush it off, to smile politely and say everything was fine. That's what I'd always done, mask the loneliness, hide the cracks. But something about the warmth in her expression broke me open. My throat tightened, and before I knew it, I was inviting her in, apologizing for the mess, for the untouched food still sitting on the table, like evidence of a crime. She stepped inside, her gaze lingering on the full spread. I waited for her to comment, to ask why the table was set for so many when no one was there. But she didn't. Instead, she placed the basket down and said, "You must have worked so hard." Her words were simple, but they landed with more comfort than any of the hollow thanks I'd ever received from my family. We sat at the table together, just the two of us. For the first time, someone actually reached for the food I had made, and though it was cold, she ate it without complaint. We talked about small things at first, the weather, the neighborhood, the decorations she'd seen around town. But gradually, I found myself telling her the truth. I told her about the invitations, the promises, the silence. I told her about the lists I had written that morning, the imbalance of giving and receiving. Eleanor listened, really listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to explain it away or tell me to forgive. She simply nodded, her eyes kind but steady, as though she understood more than she let on. When I finished, she placed her hand over mine and said, "Sometimes family is chosen, not given. And sometimes kindness comes from the people you least expect." Her words lingered long after she left. I sat at the table, staring at the empty plates, but they didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. For once, the silence didn't mock me. Instead, it felt like space, room for something new to grow. That evening, I cleared the table. Not because I expected anyone to arrive, but because I was ready to put the night behind me. I packed away the leftovers, gave some to Eleanor, and threw out what I couldn't keep. With every dish I washed, I felt a little lighter, as though I was scrubbing away not just the food, but the years of expectation that had chained me to this role of endless provider. The neighbor's knock had been small, almost insignificant compared to the weight of betrayal I carried. Yet in that moment, it reminded me of something important. I wasn't invisible, not to everyone, and maybe that was enough to start again. In the days that followed, the house felt different, lighter somehow. The silence was still there, but it no longer pressed on me with the same cruelty. Instead, it felt like space, open, unclaimed, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. For the first time in years, I realized I didn't have to fill it with frantic planning or desperate hope. I could fill it with myself. I started small. A walk around the neighborhood without rushing back in case the phone rang. A cup of tea enjoyed slowly in the morning sun instead of gulped down before the day's work. I even dusted off the easel tucked away in the attic, the one I hadn't touched in decades. My hands were clumsy at first, the brushstrokes uneven, but it didn't matter. The act itself felt like breathing again after years of holding it in. Eleanor checked in often, sometimes with a casserole, sometimes just with a smile from across the fence. She asked if I wanted to join her for a knitting group at the community center. Normally, I would have said no, claiming I was too busy, or that my family might need me. But this time, I said yes. The group welcomed me without question, their conversations flowing with ease, their laughter unforced. I found myself smiling, really smiling. Not the painted-on grin I wore at family gatherings when I tried to hide my exhaustion. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the same one that had once felt like a stage for disappointment, and I realized I hadn't checked my phone all day. No part of me was waiting for a message, an apology, or a last-minute excuse. The stillness no longer screamed abandonment. It whispered possibility. Choosing myself wasn't about slamming the door on my family forever. It was about opening a door I had kept locked for too long, the one that led back to my own life. I had given so much of myself away that I barely remembered what it felt like to want something purely for me. Now, with each step I took, I was remembering. I began to plan, not reunions, not dinners, not sacrifices for others, but plans that fed my soul. A weekend trip Eleanor suggested to a nearby town. A painting class at the library. Long walks with no destination, letting the crisp air sting my cheeks and remind me I was alive. There was grief in it too, of course. Every joy was shadowed by the knowledge of who wasn't there to share it. But grief, I realized, didn't have to be an anchor. It could also be a teacher. It told me what I valued, what I had lost, and what I still had time to find. For the first time, I looked at the calendar not with dread, but with curiosity. Tomorrow didn't have to be another day of waiting. It could be mine. And as I closed my notepad, the one with the lists I had written, I added a new page with a single heading. What I choose from now on. The page was blank, but it was mine to fill. The shift was gradual, but unmistakable. Each day, I felt myself stepping further out of the shadows I had lived in for so long. The house, once a shrine to family gatherings, began to change with me. The dining table, no longer set for others, became my own workspace. I spread out paints and brushes across its polished wood, letting the colors stain where plates once rested. The living room, which had echoed with imagined laughter, now carried the soft murmur of audiobooks and the steady rhythm of my knitting needles. Slowly, the spaces I had prepared for them transformed into spaces that belonged to me. It felt strange at first, almost rebellious, to fill my time without centering it around their needs. I caught myself hesitating before buying a ticket to an art exhibit, thinking, what if they call me? What if they finally come by? Then I remembered the empty table, the silence that had spoken louder than any words, and I pressed the button to confirm my reservation. The freedom in that single choice was intoxicating. Eleanor introduced me to more of her friends at the community center. They were not replacements for my family. No one could be. But they were companions. We shared meals that were simple and genuine, not elaborate productions meant to prove my worth. We laughed at silly things. We asked each other how our days had been, and the care in their voices was real. I hadn't realized how much I missed that kind of everyday tenderness until it was offered freely. I began to notice changes in myself too. My posture straightened. My laughter came easier. The constant tension in my chest, the one I used to carry when waiting for their calls, began to loosen. Even the mirror seemed kinder. I no longer saw a woman shrinking into invisibility, but someone reclaiming pieces of herself she had long abandoned. It wasn't about forgetting them. I still thought of my children and grandchildren every day. Their faces lived in my heart, etched deep into memory. But I no longer built my days around their absence. I no longer offered pieces of myself to a table where no one came to sit. Instead, I began offering those pieces to myself. The transformation was quiet, almost ordinary, but it felt like a revolution. Each new joy was small, a finished painting, a new recipe tried, a walk by the river. But together, they built something stronger than the endless cycle of waiting. They built a life that felt like mine. And in those moments of stillness, when the ghosts of old memories tried to creep back in, I would look around at the evidence of this new life and whisper to myself, I am still here. I still matter. For the first time in decades, I believed it.
The days slipped into weeks, and soon the reunion that never happened became just another date on the calendar. The decorations were packed away, the dishes long since cleaned, the candles burned down to nothing. What remained was not emptiness, but a gentler kind of quiet. A quiet I could live with, even cherish. I slowed my pace. I let mornings stretch longer than they ever had. I would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sunlight creep across the floor, and I didn't rush to fill the hours. There was a strange sweetness in doing nothing, in simply existing without obligation. For so long, my time had been borrowed, traded away for the chance to be included. Now it belonged only to me. The lists I had written stayed in the drawer by my bed. Sometimes I would pull them out, trace my fingers over the words, and remember the woman I was when I wrote them. Tired, hurt, desperate to make sense of the imbalance. Then, I would fold them back carefully, because I no longer needed to reread them to believe they were true. The truth had settled into me like a quiet resolve. I had already chosen differently. I found myself painting more often. At first it was only small strokes, hesitant shapes. But then, as the days passed, the canvas bloomed with color. One evening, I stepped back from a finished piece and realized what it was. A dining table, long and wide, filled with food, with light, with empty chairs. It was not a sad painting. It was luminous, glowing, like a memory honored and released. I hung it on the wall, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of survival. Sometimes I wondered if they thought of me, if they ever looked back at the day they chose a vacation over my last request. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. The difference no longer cut as deeply. Because whether they remembered or not, I had moved forward. I had built a life that wasn't defined by their absence. When the holidays rolled around again, I didn't set a grand table. Instead, I made myself a simple meal, lit a single candle, and let the room stay quiet. It wasn't a silence of abandonment anymore. It was a silence of peace. And so, I whisper to you now, as the story drifts to its end, don't waste your life waiting for people who will not come. Don't mistake obligation for love or transaction for care. Choose yourself even when it feels lonely, especially then, because in that choosing, you will discover that solitude can be gentle, that endings can carry a kind of freedom, and that even in silence, you are still whole. The light in the room softens, the edges blur, and the voices of memory fade into the distance. All that remains is a slow exhale, a quiet goodnight, and the knowledge that dignity is a love story you write for yourself.